Some nights don't announce themselves. No warning, no sign, just a regular Thursday that decides, on its own, to become the night you won't stop thinking about weeks later. Elise Monroe wasn't looking for anything. She had a drink she barely touched, a big morning ahead, and a heart that had already been through enough. Tyler Dunkan wasn't supposed to be there either, but he was. And the moment their eyes met across that bar, something shifted. Quiet, almost invisible. The kind of thing you only recognize later, when it's already too late to pretend it didn't happen. If you enjoy stories like this one, subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It means everything to us and keeps these stories alive. Now settle in, because this one is worth every second. I've been in New York long enough to stop expecting it to surprise me. 3 years in the same apartment, same subway line, same coffee order. Oat milk latte, no sugar, because somewhere along the way I decided that was the version of me I was going with. My name is Elise Monroe, and up until last Thursday, I would have told you my life was fine. Not great, not falling apart, just fine. I was between jobs, which sounds better than it is. I'd left my last position at a mid-size marketing firm after my manager took credit for a campaign I built from scratch, and I smiled through it for 4 months before I finally stopped smiling. The interview I had lined up for Friday morning felt like the first real shot I'd had in a while. Senior strategist role, good company, the kind of position that could actually mean something. I spent most of Thursday reviewing my notes, rehearsing answers in my head, telling myself I was ready. By 8 o'clock, I needed to get out of my apartment. There's a bar 2 blocks from my building called Arden. Nothing fancy, just low lighting, decent drinks, and enough background noise to make you feel less alone without having to talk to anyone. I went there to decompress, not to meet anyone. I sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey sour, and pulled up my notes one more time on my phone. I wasn't even really reading them. I was just staring at the screen, thinking about everything that could go wrong the next morning. That's when he sat down. Not right next to me, 1 seat over, which in New York means nothing, but something about the way he did it felt deliberate. Quiet. Like a man who'd learned to take up space without announcing it. I didn't look up right away, but I noticed him. Dark jacket, no tie, the kind of tired that doesn't come from one bad day. He ordered straight bourbon and didn't touch his phone, which, honestly, caught my attention more than anything else. After a few minutes, he glanced at my screen, just briefly, and said, "You actually like reading strategy frameworks at night, or is that a coping mechanism?" I looked at him. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something in his expression. Not quite a smirk, more like he already knew the answer and was curious what I'd say anyway. "Coping mechanism," I said. "Big morning." He nodded slowly, like that was the most reasonable thing he'd heard all week. "Same," he said, and turned back to his drink. That was it. That was the whole conversation, for about 4 minutes. And then, for a reason I still can't fully explain, I asked him what his morning had in it. He turned to look at me again, and this time, something in his eyes shifted, just slightly, like a door opening an inch. "More than I was ready for," he said. I had no idea how much that answer would end up applying to both of us. His name was Tyler. He told me about 20 minutes into the conversation, almost as an afterthought, like names were a formality we'd already moved past. I told him mine, and he repeated it once. Elise. the way some people do when they're actually trying to remember something, not just being polite. We talked the way strangers sometimes do when neither of them has anywhere to be, and both of them are carrying something too heavy to hold alone. Not about the heavy things, not at first. He asked me what kind of work I did, and I gave him the short version: marketing, strategy, currently in transition. He didn't push. I asked what he did, and he said he worked in consulting, which could mean 100 different things, and I didn't push either. There was something comfortable about not knowing too much. The bar got louder around 9. Someone put on music. The bartender refilled my drink without me asking, which I took as a sign to stop thinking so hard about the morning. Tyler had shifted slightly in his seat at some point. I'm not sure exactly when, but he was closer than he'd been at the start. Not inappropriately close, just close enough that I was aware of it. He had a way of listening that I wasn't used to. Most people listen while waiting to talk. He actually went quiet, looked at you, let the silence sit there without rushing to fill it. It made me say more than I intended to. I told him about the job I'd left. Not all of it, but enough. The campaign, the manager, the 4 months of smiling through something that wasn't right. He didn't say, "You should have left sooner," or "That's so unfair." He just said, "That kind of thing costs more than people realize." And something about the way he said it made me think he wasn't only talking about my situation. I almost asked. I didn't. Around 10:30, I checked the time and made a comment about needing to be sharp in the morning. He nodded, and for a second I thought that was going to be it. A nice conversation with a stranger, the kind you remember for a day or two and then it fades. But then he said, "One more drink won't hurt your interview." It wasn't a line. It was too casual to be a line. It was just an honest preference, poorly disguised as a suggestion. I laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You don't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I'm not ready for this to be over." The simplicity of it caught me off guard. No performance, no charm offensive. Just a man saying a true thing out loud, and then looking slightly surprised he'd said it. I stayed. We ordered another round. The conversation shifted somewhere warmer after that, less careful, more real. At some point, his hand rested on the bar close enough to mine that the distance between them stopped feeling accidental. I didn't move mine either, and somewhere between the second drink and the last call, the night stopped feeling like something I needed to survive, and started feeling like something I didn't want to end. What I didn't let myself think about, not yet, was that I still didn't know his last name. The bar called last round at 11:45. The bartender didn't have to say it twice. The crowd had already thinned. The music had dropped to something slower, and the night had that particular quality it gets when it knows it's running out of time. Tyler settled the tab before I could even reach for my card. I started to object, and he just shook his head once. Not in a showy way, just the way someone does when the decision is already made. We walked out together without really discussing it. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk was still wet. The kind of night where the city smells like concrete and something almost clean. We stood outside for a moment, neither of us in a hurry, even though we both had reasons to be. He asked if I lived far. I told him 10 minutes on foot. He said he was in a hotel 2 blocks north. He was in the city for work, had been for the past week, flying back Sunday. There it was, a detail that should have made the whole thing feel lighter, simpler. Instead, it made something in my chest go a little tight. We started walking in the same direction anyway, because his hotel was on the way, and neither of us suggested otherwise. The conversation had slowed down by then. Not awkwardly, just naturally, the way it does when words start to feel less necessary. At some point, his arm brushed mine and stayed there, not quite linked, just close enough that every step we took, I was aware of exactly how much space wasn't between us. I was aware of other things too. The way he moved, unhurried, certain, like a man who'd stopped trying to prove something a long time ago. The sound of his voice when he said something low and quiet, just for me to hear. The fact that I hadn't thought about my interview in over an hour. We stopped at the corner near his hotel. This was the part where the night was supposed to end cleanly. A nice goodbye, maybe a handshake that lingered a second too long, and then each of us carrying the memory of a good conversation back to our separate mornings. He looked at me in that way he had, direct but not aggressive, like a question he was too careful to ask out loud. I should have said goodnight. I knew I should. I had notes to review, sleep to get, a version of tomorrow that required me to be sharp and composed and entirely focused. But he said, "I know you have somewhere to be in the morning." A pause. "I just don't want tonight to end on a sidewalk." It wasn't pressure. It was honesty, again. That same disarming honesty he'd been using all night, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe that's what made it impossible to walk away from. I looked at him for a moment, the city quiet around us, and made a decision I knew I'd either never regret or never fully explain. "Neither do I said, and we walked inside together. I woke up before the alarm. 5:58, 2 minutes before the 6 o'clock I'd set on my phone, which was sitting on the nightstand next to a glass of water I didn't remember pouring. The room was quiet and still half dark, that particular gray light that exists right before the city decides to start again. For exactly 3 seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then I did. Tyler was asleep beside me, one arm resting above his head, breathing slow and even, completely still in the way that some people are when sleep actually comes easy to them. I lay there for a moment and just looked at the ceiling. The night before felt close and far away at the same time, vivid in pieces, soft around the edges. I didn't regret it. That surprised me a little, honestly. I'd expected to wake up with that tight, anxious feeling I know well, the one that shows up after any decision made outside of careful planning. But it wasn't there. What was there instead was something quieter, something I didn't want to name too quickly. I got up carefully, found my clothes in the low light without turning anything on. I moved slowly, not to be secretive, just because the morning felt fragile and I didn't want to break it. I was pulling on my jacket when he spoke. "You don't have to go yet." His voice was low, still half asleep, and he hadn't moved. I paused. "I have to be across town by 9, I said. "It's not even 6. "I know." A beat. "I still have to get ready." He was quiet for a second. Then, "How are you feeling?" It was such a direct question for that hour of the morning that I almost laughed. I thought about giving him the easy answer. Instead, I said, "Honestly, a little like I broke one of my own rules." He turned his head to look at me then, and even in the low light, I could see something shift in his expression. Not guilt, something more careful than that. "Did you want to?" he asked. I picked up my bag. "That's the part I'm still working out," I said, and I meant it. He sat up slowly. He looked like a man who wanted to say something and was deciding whether it was the right time. The fact that he didn't say it, that he just looked at me with that quiet, steady attention, somehow felt more significant than if he had. I told him I hoped his week finished well. He said he hoped my morning went exactly the way I'd prepared for. We looked at each other for a moment longer than a casual goodbye requires, and then I walked to the door. In the elevator on the way down, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall and gave myself a very firm internal reminder that I had an interview in 3 hours, that I was prepared, that last night was last night, and this morning was something else entirely. I believed about half of it. I stepped out onto the street and pulled my jacket against the cold and started walking toward my apartment, telling myself the flutter in my chest was just nerves about the interview. It wasn't. I gave myself exactly 40 minutes to shower, change, and become someone who had slept a full 8 hours and wasn't thinking about a man whose last name she still didn't know. I managed the shower and the change. The rest was a work in progress. The offices of Dunkan and Meridian Consulting were on the 31st floor of a building on 6th Avenue that announced itself quietly. No flashy lobby, no oversized logo, just clean lines and the kind of stillness that comes from people who don't need to prove anything. I checked in at the front desk at 8:50, which was exactly right. Not eager, not late. The receptionist gave me a visitor badge and asked me to take a seat, and I sat in one of the low chairs near the window and looked out at the city and told myself to breathe. The interview was for a senior strategist position. I'd applied 6 weeks ago, gone through 2 phone screens, and been told the final round would be with the director of the division. I knew the company. I'd done the research. I was ready. A woman came to collect me around 9:10. Professional, efficient, the kind of person who moves through an office like she knows exactly how much everything costs. She walked me down a hallway and stopped at a set of glass doors and said, "Mr. Duncan will be right with you. Can I get you anything?" I said no thank you and stepped inside. The room had a long table, 6 chairs, and a view of Midtown that on any other morning I would have taken a moment to appreciate. I set my bag down, smoothed my jacket, and pulled out the single printed copy of my portfolio I'd brought, because I always think better with something in my hands. I heard the door behind me. I turned around, and every carefully constructed thought in my head dissolved at once. Tyler was standing in the doorway in a charcoal suit, no tie, looking exactly like himself, except for the fact that he was here, in this room, in this building, with a visitor badge that said nothing because he didn't need one. He wasn't wearing a visitor badge. He worked here. The look on his face lasted only a second. Surprise, recognition, something that moved too fast for me to read. And then it was replaced by something composed and careful and entirely professional. He walked to the head of the table, set down a leather folder, and said, in a voice that gave away absolutely nothing, "Ms. Monroe, I'm Tyler Duncan. Thank you for coming in." I stood very still. Duncan. The name on the building. Of course it was. I had exactly 2 seconds to decide who I was going to be in this room. I pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, and met his eyes with every ounce of composure I had left. "Thank you for having me," I said. My voice came out steady, steadier than I felt. He looked at me for just a beat longer than necessary before he opened his folder. And in that beat, behind all that professionalism, I saw it. The faintest trace of something that wasn't business at all. Neither of us said a word about the night before, but it was the only thing in the room. The interview lasted 45 minutes. I answered every question. I gave examples, cited numbers, walked him through my thinking on 2 case studies he put in front of me. I was, by any objective measure, prepared. Tyler was professional in a way that almost made it worse. He asked sharp questions, listened carefully, pushed back when my answers were too safe. There was no trace of the man from the bar, not in his posture, not in his tone, not in the way he looked at me when I was speaking. Almost none. There was one moment, about 20 minutes in, when I was explaining how I'd rebuilt a content strategy from scratch after a campaign failure, and I looked up mid-sentence and found him watching me with an expression that wasn't quite neutral. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he wrote something down and asked his next question. When it was over, he stood, thanked me for my time, and told me the team would be in touch within the week. We shook hands at the door. His grip was firm and brief and entirely appropriate. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stared at the doors until they opened. On the way down, I ran through the interview in my head. The questions, my answers, the moments I could have been sharper. I was good. I knew I was good. What I didn't know was whether any of it mattered now, whether the situation was already too complicated to survive, whether I'd walked into the one opportunity I actually wanted and quietly destroyed it before it had a chance to become anything. I stepped out onto 6th Avenue and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the city moving around me at its usual indifferent pace. My phone buzzed, a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. The text read, "You were the strongest candidate in the room. That part has nothing to do with the other thing. T." I read it twice, then a third time. I stood there on that sidewalk, holding my phone, and felt something shift. Not relief exactly, and not quite hope. Something more complicated than either. Something that was going to require a decision I wasn't ready to make yet. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. That was part 1 of Elise and Tyler's story. Part 2 is coming, and trust me, things are about to get a lot more complicated. How would you rate this story so far? Drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments. We read every single one. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you in the next one.